Hello everybody. Today in this video we are going to be talking about going from a percent to a fraction. In the other videos we'll talk about going the other way, but here we're going to talk about when you start with a percent, how do you make it a fraction? And the way I want you to start thinking about this is I want you to pause the video and I want you to, looking at this picture, tell me what fraction you think this represents and then maybe what percent. We'll talk about what percent it is and how that relates to the fractions. You might want to count some squares and get a fraction and then maybe a percent that you think this picture represents. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you paused and did your best to figure out what fraction this would be. Well, if you count the squares, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's 100 squares, right? 10 rows of 10. So we have 100 squares in there total. Okay, the amount that are shaded, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the whole rows are shaded. That's 70. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 77 blue squares out of 100 total squares. So as a fraction, we can write this as 77 100ths. Okay. Now, if possible, I'd want to reduce this, but if I look at these numbers, there is nothing that goes into both of those. So this is as simple as it can get. Okay. Now, the key to writing this as a percent is to remember that percent means out of 100. So 77 out of 100 literally means 77%. The same thing. Okay. So there's a connection here between the fraction, when you have 100 in the denominator, and the numerator connects to that percent. So we're going to see how we can use that. So the steps, if you're giving a percent, you're going to write it as that number divided by 100 because that's what percent means. Percent means out of 100. Okay, and after we've done that, if possible, we're going to simplify and reduce the fraction. Sometimes we'll be able to do that, sometimes we won't. Okay, so here's an example, 11%. Well, remember that percent means out of 100. So that is 11 out of 100. Okay, if I try to find numbers that go into both of these, so 11 is a prime number and it doesn't go into 100. So there is no number that we can reduce that by. Our answer is just 11 hundredths. Okay, this one, 75%. Again, we just write as 75 over 100. That's step one. You have the percent be the numerator and 100 be the denominator. And then this one we can reduce. Okay? You may be able to tell what the biggest number is, maybe you can't. If I use my divisibility rules, I see this ends with a 5 and this ends with a 0. So I know at very least you could divide the top and bottom by 5. So if you do that, 75 divided by 5, you might have to bring that over here. 5 goes into 7 one time. 1 minus 5 is 5. Subtract it, I get a 2. Bring down the 5. 5 goes into 25 exactly 5 times with nothing left over. Okay, so 15 is my answer. 15 on top. 100 divided by 5, you may know is 20. Okay, now if I look at these numbers, just because I reduced it once doesn't mean it's reduced all the way I can go. I still have a 15 and a 20. It still ends with a 5 and a 0, so I could still divide by 5. So if I divide the top and bottom by 5 again, 15 divided by 5 is 3. 20 divided by 5 is 4. So 75% is the same as 3/4. All right. Well, let's look at 150%. Now, the thing you might notice, this is more than 100%. Like we've talked about in other videos, that means my decimal is going to be more than 1, or my fraction in this case. So I should end up with probably a mixed number at the end of the day. But I'm going to start the same way. I'm going to put the percent out of 100. So 150 out of 100. Okay. Then I'm going to reduce this. So if you think about what goes into both of these, it may take you a couple steps to get here, but I can tell that these are both multiples of 50. So I can divide both of these by 50. 150 divided by 50 is 3. 100 divided by 50 is 2. So this is 3 halves. Now to get to our fully simplified answer, I'm going to want to turn this into a mixed number. So remembering how to do that, 2 goes into 3 one time with 1 left over. So it is 1 and 1 half. Okay, I got 2 halves in that hole, plus another half is 3 halves. Okay, so 150% is 1.5. Okay, 17.5%. So this is where it gets just a little tricky because of that decimal. But I'm going to start the same way. We always put this over 100. So 17.5 out of 100. Now, what we don't want here is we don't want a decimal in our fraction. So just like when we were dividing and we had a decimal where we didn't want it, we can get rid of this decimal by moving the decimal point over. Okay, we should have to make sure we're doing the same thing to the top and bottom of our fraction. So 17.5%, if I want to make that 175, move the decimal point, so that's the whole number. Okay, that means what I did is I multiplied the top by 10. Right? Moving that decimal 1 to the right is the same as multiplying by 10. Okay? So if I move the decimal 1 to the right here, I got to move the decimal 1 to the right here. Again, the decimal starts at the end. Okay, if I move it over, I got to fill in a 0. Okay, which again is the same thing as multiplying by 10. So 100 times 10, if you add a 0, is 1,000. Okay. From this point, we just have to reduce this fraction. If I think about what goes into these numbers, I see that 175 is a number you would get if you counted by 25s. So let's start with 5s. Okay, 5s is maybe more obvious. So if I do 175 divided by 5, 5 doesn't go into 1, it goes into 17 3 times. Minus 15 is 2, bring down a 5, and then 5 is into 25 5 times. I know it'll go in evenly without a remainder because that's what it means to say this is divisible by 5. Okay, so if I divide the top and bottom by 5, I get 35 out of 1,000 divided by 5 is 200. Okay, and then you notice these are still both divisible by 5, so I can go again. Right? 35 divided by 5 is 7. 200 divided by 5 is 40. So I end up with 70/40ths. All right, let's look at a couple more examples where we have a decimal involved to make sure we know how to handle that. So 46.2%. Again, because percent means out of 100, we always start by writing over 100. 46.2 out of 100. Okay, now to get rid of that decimal point, I just have to move the decimal point one place to the right. But to balance that out, I got to do the same thing on the bottom. Okay. So I end up with 462 on top. On bottom, I have to fill in a 0. So that makes that 1,000. Okay. Now, you might not immediately know, looking at this number, what their biggest common factor is, but that's okay. Remember, we don't have to divide by the biggest one right away. We can do it in pieces as long as we're dividing something out that they have in common. Now, just looking at these numbers, I notice they're both even numbers, so I know that they're divisible by 2. That may not be the biggest number they're divisible by, but I'm going to try it. Okay, so divide by 2, I get 231 over 500. Okay, and as I try to reduce this, I can try more, but there's actually no other number that goes into both of these. So that is as much as I'm going to get to reduce. Now, if it helps, if you think back to what we know about factoring numbers, remember the prime factorization we did last unit? A 10 is made up of a 2 and a 5. If you think of the prime factors to make a 10, it's 2 and a 5. So any power of 10, whether it's 10 or 100 or 1,000, it's only going to have prime factors of 2s and 5s. So when you're reducing, If you can't divide your numerator by 2 or 5, that means you're not going to be able to reduce anymore. Right? If the bottom number is some power of 10, you can only divide out 2s and 5s. Okay? So that might help you with some of those bigger numbers to know when you can stop reducing. All right, next one, 3.15%. Percent always means over 100. Okay, this time to get this to be a whole number, I got to move the decimal 2 places. So the top becomes 315. On the bottom, I'm moving the decimal 2 places also, and that means I'm adding 2 zeros. So this 100 becomes 10,000. Okay. Now I'm going to reduce. If I look at the last number, this ends with a 5, this ends with a 0. So I know they're divisible by 5. I can do the bottom one in my head for sure. 10,000 divided by 5 is 2,000. On top, I might not be able to do that in my head, so I'm going to take that over here. 315. If I divide this by 5, okay, 5 doesn't go into 3. It goes into 31 6 times, which is 30. Subtract, and I have 1. Bring down the 5. 5 goes into 15 3 times. Okay, so I get 63. So I have 63 over 2,000. Okay, and now by the trick that I mentioned before, I can't divide this by 2 or 5, so I know I can't reduce that anymore. All right, last one, 8.3%. Percent means out of 100. Okay, to get the decimal out of there, I just got to move it over 1 place. So that's 83. On the bottom, I have 1,000. Okay, and right away, I cannot reduce this. 2s and 5s don't go into 83. There's nothing that these are going to have in common. So I am done. Okay? All right, so go ahead and try the first part of your homework, and I'll see you in the next video.